you have a Bible, and if you don't, I think there's some in front of you, or your phone, or whatever you use, turn to Genesis 23. Genesis 23. For those of you that were not here last week, or as a reminder, last week we covered Genesis 21 and 22, and we talked about God fulfilling the promise to give Abraham a son that they named Isaac, which means laughter. And we read about how this had been 25 years in the making, that Abraham received the promises of God when he was 75 years old, and now at 100 years old, Abraham has a son, and a son legitimately, born of the Spirit, not of the flesh. And we saw that Hagar, who was the slave of Sarah, whom fathered Ishmael with Abraham, they were sent away. But God did not forget them, and God kept his promises to Ishmael that he too would be a nation. And of course, that nation was born out of the flesh. It was born out of Abraham trying to take matters into his own hand. And what we saw was, what we still see today actually, is the nation of Israel that comes from the line of Isaac, and all the Arab nations that came from the line of Ishmael still at war. And that will continue on until Christ himself comes back. We read about the treaty at Beersheba. Won't go into detail there. And then we talked about the test that Abraham faced when he was asked by God to go to the mountain and sacrifice his son, his one and only son. And we spent quite a bit of time last week talking about the parallels between Isaac's call to be sacrificed and Jesus's call to be sacrificed. And we saw that Abraham went out early in the morning, took his son, took all the stuff they needed for the burnt offering, but did not take the lamb, and God, of course, provided the ram. And now we fast forward to Genesis 23. We're going to get through Genesis 23, and depending on timing, we may jump into Genesis 24, but Genesis 24 is quite long, so we may have to save that for next week. The first 9 verses of Genesis 23. Sarah lived to be 127 years old. She died at Kiriath Arba, that is Hebron. That name should sound familiar to you. In the land of Canaan. And Abraham went to mourn for Sarah and weep over her. Then Abraham rose from beside his dead wife and spoke to the Hittites. And he said, I am a foreigner and stranger among you. Sell me some property for a burial site here so that I can bury my dead. And the Hittites replied to Abraham, Sir, listen to us. You are a mighty prince among us. Bury your dead in the choicest of our tombs. None of us will refuse you his tomb for burying your dead. Then Abraham rose and bowed down before the people of the land, the Hittites, and he said to them, If you are willing to let me bury my dead, then listen to me. And intercede with Ephron, son of Zohar, on my behalf. So he will sell me the cave of Machpelah, which belongs to him and is at the end of his field. Ask him to sell it to me at full price as a burial site among you. The Bible begins chapter 23 by stating that Sarah was 127 years old, which means that she lived long enough to see her son turn 37. Because if you remember, Sarah was 90 years old when Isaac was born. And again, before we start thinking, in the Bible they lived much longer, this was after the flood, so people did not live all that much longer. So it would be like a 90-year-old today giving birth. Medically impossible. Ladies, imagine that. 90 years old and you're giving birth for the first time. Crazy thought. But God, when God speaks a promise, he always fulfills it. And so here's Sarah, 90 years old, gives birth, and now 37 years later, she passes away. Verse 2 tells us that Sarah died at a place called Kiriath Arba, also known as Hebron, in the land of Canaan. And we read that Abraham went and mourned for her and wept for her, and she was the love of his life. They had spent, close to 100 years together at this point. And, they were closer at death when she died than when they first met. But you need to pay attention to something here, because going on, we're going to see something happen. It talks about the first couple of verses about the land of the Hittites, because Hittites were an empire. They had an empire that covered and controlled a great deal of land in the Middle East, kind of like Egypt did down in northern Africa. And the Hittites during Abraham's time largely controlled Canaan's land, or Canaan. Abraham needed to deal with them because he needed to obtain a burial spot for his wife Sarah, because he'd been promised that land by the Lord. But what does that matter? Because Abraham had no legal right to any land in Canaan. So God had made the promise, again, many years before. Now we're about 57 years away out from the promise. And God had made the promise that I will give you this land to you and your children, right? And your inheritance, your offspring. But he had no way of obtaining land. Other groups occupied it. At this time, the Hittites did. In Abraham's culture, it's important to know that people considered it very crucial that when a family member passed away, you would go back to their ancestral land and bury them. That was just the custom. So Abraham, if he was going to follow custom, would have taken Sarah, his deceased wife, back to Mesopotamia, where they had come from, to the land of, does anyone know where he was from? From Ur of the Chaldeans, right? And that's where God called him from 57 years before, to leave that land and go to the land that God would show him. So if Abraham was going to keep with custom, he would have taken Sarah back down to Ur and buried her. But notice, Abraham doesn't do that. He breaks with tradition, because we know that tradition can kill, and he creates a new situation for him and his ancestors. Abraham seeks a burial plot in Canaan, which again would later become the nation of Israel. This indicates that Abraham now is wanting to establish a new ancestral home. It shows that he renounces his old biological ancestral land in Ur and is embracing the promise that God gave him to live in Canaan, or Israel. God had promised that to him, and he understood that promise. And it meant from that point on, if he could obtain some land to bury his wife in, he legally owned that, and now he had a claim to some land in Israel, or Canaan. I'm using that interspersed, but it's Canaan at the time. Later becomes Israel. It's like planting a flag, right? And saying, this is my homeland. When Christopher Columbus came to America and planted the flag, he claimed it, right, for the king and queen. And that's kind of what this was like. Abraham is taking a stand. He's planting his family in a new homeland. He's given up the past. When God called him, he called him to a better future. He called him to promises. When God calls you, he's calling you from your past. And he's calling you to leave that and to create your own new beginning in him. So, now Abraham can say, this is my homeland. Now, not only now my wife is buried here, when I pass away, I will be buried here. My son Isaac will be buried here, his family, and on down the line, Jacob and, Joseph, and then we go all the way down, and they now have an inheritance in the land of Israel. This took an act of faith on his part, right? Remember, he's a stranger. He's a nobody. He's rich. We know that Abraham had a lot of money at this time. He had a lot of money, but he was still wandering around in that area. He hadn't found a place to settle. But remember, God had said, I will give you this land. At one point, he owned nothing, and now he owns a cave, right? And as we read on, we're going to see something else happens. All Abraham's asking for is a cave. I just need a cave to bury my wife. That's all he wants. He locates a cave. He finds this cave, and this man named Ephron owns it. And he tells the Hittites, can you talk with Ephron and tell him, I just want the cave. That's all I need to bury my wife, and I'll be happy. Okay? But pay attention to what happens next. Verse 10. Ephraim the Hittite was sitting among his people, and he replied to Abraham in the hearing of all the Hittites who had come to the gate of the city. No, my lord, he said, listen to me. I give you the field, and I give you the cave that is in it. I give it to you in the presence of my people. Bury your dead. There's two important things to remember here. It sounds very much like Ephraim. When you just read that at face value, it sounds like Ephraim is just the nicest guy in the world, and he's giving Abraham the cave. And not only that, but he's giving Abraham the field that accompanies the cave. And he's doing it free of charge, is what it kind of sounds like, doesn't it? But that's not how actually was happening. This was a common bargaining technique in the Middle East at the time. He's pretty much saying, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to make this bargain with you. I'll give you not only the cave, but you get the land with it. But in exchange, he wants something. And again, we don't see that here, but remember Abraham said, I will pay fair price for it, you know. And Ephraim is like, this is a great idea. Not only can I get money for the cave, but I'm going to give him my whole field. It's just a bargaining technique. Secondly, it's important to notice that, again, Ephraim doesn't want to just give Abraham the cave. He wants to give him all the land. And what we found, archaeologists have found, when looking at Hittite culture and doing archaeological digs, they found laws that were associated with the buying and selling of lands in Canaan at the time. And so we know that there was an advantage for Ephraim to sell not just the cave, but the land to Abraham. So before we go on and think, oh, Ephraim was such a nice guy, he's given the cave, he's given the land to Abraham, that's not what it was about. Ephraim actually was kind of he was trying to get the best deal for himself. There were tax obligations, just like we have taxes, right? You own land, guess what you got to do? You got to pay Uncle Sam. I've finally got Elijah. For those of you that don't know, my oldest, he's going to be 16 next week, 2 weeks. And finally got him to understand that even if you buy land flat out cash once a year, guess what? Uncle Sam comes a knocking and you got to pay him whether you want to or not. He's like, but why? I own the land. I'm like, yeah, but you don't really own anything in America. Like, the government owns it all, right? And so that was the same thing even in this culture. Way back, 4,000 years ago, Ephraim knew that he had taxes due on this land. And so he probably owned other land. And here comes Abraham, and he's wanting this cave, and he goes, I can get out of this taxes if I just give him or sell him this cave. And not just the cave, but all this land. I can save money while making money from the sale. So again, Abraham, cave, Ephraim, cave and field. He wants to get out of obligations of having to pay the king. And then we read on in verse 12. Again, Abraham bowed down before the people of the land. And he said to Ephraim in their hearing, listen to me, if you will. I will pay the price of the field. Accept it from me so I can bury my dead there. So Abraham's agreeing. He's like, okay, I'll buy the whole field. And he knows that the cave is included in it. And then Ephraim answered Abraham, listen to me, my lord. The land is worth 400 shekels of silver. But what is that between you and me? Bury your dead. Again, Ephraim still sounds like he's a nice guy, right? He still pretends to be gracious, willing to help out the poor man, right? His wife just died, and Abraham now is, 100, and he's 10 years older, so he's 137 years old, and Ephraim's probably, in his middle 50s, 60s, and so he's like, I'll help the old man out. Like, he lost his wife, he doesn't want to take her all the way back to Ur to bury her. I get something out of it, let me just be nice about this. And so he says, it's $400. And then he ends it with, what did he say? He said, but what is that between me and you, or you and me? This was, again, a bargaining technique. And the land was probably valued much lower than the 400 shekels of silver. But, again, in the Middle East, when you give a price, they expect you to haggle back and forth, right? You go to a car dealership, Lord help us. And They never tell you the upfront price. Even when you say, and we've walked out of dealerships before because I'm like, I want the lowest price the first time or I'm walking. And they give you a price and you get up and they're like, no. I'm like, no, you had one time, we're leaving. That's just part of it. And in America, we don't do that too well. Other countries, that's what they do for a living. That's how they live. They bargain. And so that's what's happening here. Ephraim totally expected Abraham to come back and say, really? I'll give you 300 shekels or whatever and go back and forth. But we don't see that. And we'll read that here in a minute. Again, we've learned from contracts in the Hittite culture that this piece of land was totally overvalued. And I don't know how they know that, but archaeologists, I guess, have found written records around that time period on, not written in paper, but chiseled out and stuff that of fields that they had sold, and they would have been much less than what was being asked. Again, he expected Abraham to kind of bargain with him and haggle with him. So he started off with what he thought would be a good price until they got down to a reasonable price. But what does Abraham say? He says, no, I'll take it, right? And we read that in 16, we'll read through 18. Abraham agreed to Ephraim's terms and weighed out for him the price he had named in the hearing of the Hittites, 400 shekels of silver, according to the weight current among the merchants. So Ephraim's field in Machpelah, near Mamre, both the field and the cave in it, and all the trees with their borders of the field was deeded to Abraham as his property in the presence of all the Hittites who had come to the gate of the city. So notice, Abraham doesn't argue. He doesn't try to negotiate. And again, I think some of that is, there's several reasons probably. One, Abraham had money. Right? We know that God blessed Abraham. If you remember, now it's been over a month ago when I was reading about Abraham going into Egypt and what happened. The Egyptian king, Pharaoh, he sent Abraham out, kicked him out of the country, but didn't just kick him out, but sent him with a lot of goods, right? And we know that before Abraham, when he left Ur, had a lot of wealth. So Abraham didn't care about money, number one. Number two, Abraham had just lost his wife. He's sad. Right? Anyone that's lost a loved one, especially a spouse or a kid, guys, it's hard to think straight, right? And he's probably just worn out, just like, that's fine, 400 shekels, here you go, okay? But notice where they're at. They're at the city gate. And that's mentioned now 2 times that they're at the gate of the city. There was no clerk of courts that time. There was no courthouse to go to register all of this. It was at the city gate where the elders would come and they would sit, and the old men at the coffee shop, they would all gather there in the morning and they would listen to what was being said and all the business deals, and they would be the witnesses to any transaction that took place. They would oversee marriages. They would oversee the prices for the bride. They would oversee all of those transactions, buying and selling of land or buying and selling of donkeys or food. They were honored people. They had lived a good life. They were older, and so people respected them. And so all of this took place in front of the city gates. That's where covenants and contracts were signed. And the reason they obviously did that was if down the road you came back and you had a disagreement with somebody and somebody cheated you or you felt like they cheated you, you could go to that city gate and everybody that was there was a witness, right? So they've witnessed this exchange. They transferred the 400 shekels. Abraham now has the field and the cave. And it worked out, it seems, good for Abraham. He was happy and pleased. Obviously, Ephraim probably was a little bit in shock that this old man would pay him a full 400 shekels when it probably wasn't worth, quite that much. So everybody's happy in the situation. Then we read on. Afterward, Abraham buried his wife Sarah in the cave in the field of Machpelah near Mamre, which is at Hebron, in the land of Canaan. And again, God reiterates that, like, this is now Canaan. Abraham now owns a piece of land in Canaan. Abraham now has legal rights to a piece of the land that God had promised him 50 some years ago. So the field and the cave in it were deeded to Abraham by the Hittites as a burial site. And again, he repeats himself, the author does. And as we get further along in the book of Genesis, we're going to find out that this is the very cave that not only, again, Sarah was buried in, but Abraham would be buried in. It's the place where his son Isaac would be buried in, and his wife, when he gets married, would be buried in. And then also down to his grandson, Jacob and Leah, his first wife. This set up a case for the land, again, becoming Abraham's ancestral land. If we were doing this in modern days, if I were to pass away, I would go back to Wilmore in, south of Lexington. That's my ancestral home, okay? All my grandfather, my great-grandfather, my great-great-grandfather, and my dad will be buried there. We've already got our burial plot, so I hopefully will be buried there. That's kind of, we do it today, a lot of us. That was typical in Abraham's day. If I wanted to break with that, I might buy a place in town to be buried. That's kind of what Abraham did. He's like, I no longer want to be associated with my home country. This is my new home. Abraham is establishing a family connection to this land, standing on the promises that God had made for him. All right, let's move on. We'll start with 24. I think we can get through some of it. So now we get to, again, Abraham's now buried. Sarah's now buried. Abraham's about 137 years old, and he now turns his attention to his son, the promised heir to the promises of God, Isaac. So, chapter 24, Abraham was now very old, and the Lord had blessed him in every way, and he said to the senior servant in his household, the one he put in charge of all that he had, "Put your hand under my thigh. I want you to swear by the Lord, the God of heaven and the God of earth, that you will not get a wife for my son from the daughters of the Canaanites, among whom I am living, but will go to my country and my own relatives and get a wife for my son Isaac." Abraham's statement here that he was old conveys that he understands he's not going to live forever. He's just lost his wife, and now he realizes, I'm 137. There are not many people alive at my age. So he realizes, I've got to see my son get married. But he doesn't just want Isaac to get married. He does not want Isaac to get married to a Canaanite, right? Because they're foreigners, they're heathens, they're pagans, right? He's living in the land that one day he'll inherit, but he doesn't want his son to have anything to do with him. And he says to his servant, I want you to go back to the land of Ur, to Mesopotamia, and get a wife from my family, okay? He understands the importance of being set apart for God's purposes. Abraham speaks to his trusted servant, the leader of his servants, and he asks him to do something odd in our day, right? He has him swear a promise that he will not get a wife from the Canaanites, but he would go back the 450 miles to Mesopotamia to get a wife there. And he has this weird or odd swearing oath ceremony. He tells his servant put his hand under his thigh and swear that he will do what he asks. Now that's odd, right? We sign papers, we shake hands, we nod at each other, and that's our promise, right? Right now, I put my hand on the Bible, I swear to tell the truth, right? In Abraham's day, you would put your hand on the other person's thigh and make a promise, right? And the reason for that, again, for us today, that would be very odd and awkward. In Abraham's day, it was perfectly normal. And what it symbolized was, again, according to nature, children were said to have come from their father's loins or their thighs, right? So placing your hand under the thigh signifies that you're keeping this oath, not just with that person, but with their children in mind, right? How many times have you maybe heard somebody not appropriately, but say, I swear on my children's life, right? That's what this is. You're swearing not just to the man, but you're swearing to that man and his kids and your kids. Like, that's what it signified, right? And it's weird, something we wouldn't do today, but again, he's swearing on his future children that he would keep this oath that he's taken. Much later, we're going to see Jacob, who is Isaac's son, do the same thing with his son Joseph, and Joseph had to put his hand on his father's thigh and swear an oath. But that's where that comes from. So we read it, and again, it's like, why? What is that? And it's neat when you start studying some of these passages, because a lot of this I wasn't 100% familiar with. And when you start to break it down to prepare for something like this, you see the significance, right? It's more than just, hey, I'm making an oath. Like, there's a reason for that. And we read on verse 5 through 9. The servant asked him, what if a woman is unwilling to come back with me to this land? Shall I then take your son back to the country where you came from? Make sure that you do not take my son back there. So Abraham realizes, my son has to stay here. This is our land. This is what God promised us. Don't take him back. The Lord, the God of heaven, who brought me out of my father's household and my native land, and who spoke to me and promised me on oath, saying, to your offspring I will give this land, he will send his angel before you, so that you will get a wife for my son from there. If the woman is unwilling to come back with you, then you will be released from the oath of mine. Only do not take my son back there. So the servant put his hand under the thigh of his master Abraham and swore an oath to him concerning this matter. So now everything's set up, and the servant makes the oath, realizing that if he takes Isaac back, that not only would the servant likely be held accountable, but if he had children, his children could be killed, all the way down to his grandchildren. I mean, these were serious transactions, right? And then we move on. Then the servant left, taking with him 10 of his master's camels loaded with all kinds of good things from his master. He set out for Aram Naharaim and made his way to the town of Nahor. He had the camels kneel down near the well outside the town. It was toward evening, the time when the women would go out and draw water. It says that the servant took 10 camels, and again, they've traveled 450 miles. Keep that in mind as well. So this didn't just happen overnight. Sometimes when we read the Bible, we read it straight through, and it's like, it was the next morning. No, this was 450 miles. This was probably a month, because if you could travel about 15 miles a day with camels, and you do the division, which thank God for calculators, even though that's pretty simple, 30 days is about what it would take to get from Canaan, or Hebron, down to Ur. And remember the 10 camels, because that's important here in a little bit. But this servant went. He obviously took more than 10 camels. He took a lot of stuff with him, not only for the journey, but to try to convince the family of whoever the angel was going to show and prepare for him, to give them some stuff, because you still had to pay a bride's fee and all that. So he has a lot of possessions with him, 30 days, traveling 450 miles, and they finally arrive at the town of Nahor, which is right around where Abraham, again, had been living before he was called out. Then he prayed, Lord, God of my master Abraham, make me successful today and show kindness to my master Abraham. See, I am standing beside the spring, and the daughters of the townspeople are coming out to draw water. May it be that when I say to a young woman, please let down your jar, that I may have a drink, and she says, drink, and I'll water your camels too, let her be the one you have chosen for my servant Isaac. By this I will know that you have shown mercy or kindness to my master. Again, this is not just a test of who God wants to choose for Isaac as a wife. It's a test of her character as well, right? The servant is going to see that God is faithful, but he's also going to see the character of this woman. Before he had finished praying, Rebekah came out with her jar on her shoulders. She was the daughter of Bethuel, son of Milcah, who was the wife of Abraham's brother Nahor. The woman was very beautiful, a virgin. No man had ever slept with her. And she went down to the spring, filled the jar, and came up again. The servant hurried to meet her and said, "Please give me a little water from your jar." "Drink, my lord," she said, and quickly lowered the jar to her hands and gave him a drink. After she had given him a drink, she said, "I'll draw water for your camels too, until they have had enough to drink." So she quickly emptied her jar into the trough, ran back to the well to draw more water, and drew enough for all the camels. Without saying a word, the man watched her closely to learn whether or not the Lord had made his journey successful. Did you notice the question that Abraham's servant asked her? "Would you give me a little to drink?" The Hebrew phrase, if you read it in Hebrew, actually says, "Give me a sip of water." So he's not asking for a lot. He's not saying, "I've been on this journey for 30 days and I'm hot and tired and it's miserable out here. Give me a jar to drink." He actually just said, "Give me a sip of your water." That's all he asked. And then notice what she says. She says exactly what he prayed for her to say. "Not only will I give you some water, but I will give your camels some water." And he gazed on her in silence to learn whether this was the person that the Lord had sent him to get. And it's interesting because she goes, gets water for the servant, and then for the 10 camels. Camels can drink up to 30 gallons apiece. 10 camels times 30 gallons. This was no small task for Rebecca. She was going back and forth to a well, and I don't know how many gallons. I mean, let's assume that she had a gallon pitcher or jar that she lowered down, and you wound it up and brought the water up, and she took it over. And let's just assume, that the camels had already had some water and they only needed about 15 gallons. She still has to travel 150 times to that well to give the camels the drink. That is sacrifice. It proved to the servant that this woman is a hard worker. She's hospitable. She's ready to serve, just like my master Abraham needs. Somebody to come alongside, help him out, take his son, and be a servant in the household. When the camels had finished drinking, so again, the camels are full now. They stopped drinking, so no matter how many gallons it was, they were full. The man took out a gold nose ring weighing a beka and 2 gold bracelets weighing 10 shekels. Then he asked, "Whose daughter are you? Please tell me if there is room in your father's house for us to spend the night." And she answered him, "I am the daughter of Bethuel, the son of Milcah, bore to Nahor." And she added, "We have plenty of straw and fodder as well as room for you to spend the night." So we see that this is now Abraham's relative. Rebecca is actually the daughter of Abraham's nephew. So they are related. But again, in biblical days, and my kids, when I teach them this in Old Testament, New Testament, and whatever, they're just abhorred, like, they're cousins and they're getting married. I'm like, that's perfectly normal. And actually, that was advantageous in the day, right? You kept your family. I mean, you didn't get too close, or else you ended up having birth defects and issues. But, cousins married cousins, and that was normal and fine. And actually, that's what Abraham wanted. Like, go and get some of my family members and bring them up, or get this girl from my family, bring her up and let her get married to my son. We see that Rebecca not only offers accommodations for Abraham as the servant as he had asked, but she also offered food and shelter not only to him but to the animals. Again, this is showing a lot of hospitality. Can you imagine if you have kids, or they walk up to you one day and say, "Hey, Mom, Dad, I hope you don't mind. I met this guy or this girl, and they're going to stay the night at our house tonight. And not only that, but they've got like 10 camels, and we need to feed them and give them shelter." Most of us would have been like, "What are you doing?" We did talk about the hospitality, so again, the parents wouldn't have been too upset. But again, she was taking a big risk by not asking her parents, first off, just offering this up front. Verse 26. Then the man bowed down and worshipped the Lord, saying, Praise be to the Lord, the God of my master Abraham, who has not abandoned his kindness and faithfulness to my master. As for me, the Lord has led me on this journey to the house of my master's relatives. The young woman ran and told her mother's household about these things. Now Rebekah had a brother named Laban, and he hurried out to the man at the spring. And as soon as he had seen the nose ring and the bracelets on his sister's arms, and had heard Rebekah tell what the man said to her, he went out to the man and found him standing by the camels near the spring. Come, you who are blessed by the Lord, he said. Why are you standing out here? I have prepared the house and a place for the camels. As we get further along in Genesis, we're going to read more about Laban. He seems like a nice guy, right? But Laban doesn't turn out to be necessarily who we think he is. And he sees his sister with this new golden nose ring and these bracelets, and Laban thinks to himself, yeah, exactly. If he gave that to my sister, what can he give me? So again, when we read this, just like we read with Ephraim, on the surface it sounds great, like Laban's the best guy in the world and he's being so hospitable. No, Laban wanted something in return, right? We're not going to read all of Genesis 24, 32 through 48, because it's telling us everything that we just read. Because what Laban does is say, hey, tell us about what brought you here and how you got here and who you are. And so the servant tells everything that we just read about how he got there and who he was and whatever. But we pick back up in verse 49. 49, and we see, Now, if you will show kindness and faithfulness to my master, tell me. And if not, tell me, so I may know which way to turn. And Laban and Bethuel answered, This is from the Lord. We can say nothing to you one way or another. Here is Rebekah. Take her and go, and let her become the wife of your master's son, as the Lord has directed. The servant suggests that Bethuel is to give his daughter to this man whom he never met before. He claims to be a servant of Abraham, his relative, but how can he know for certain? And so they say, is this from the Lord? Again, this is an odd situation. This guy from 450 miles away comes. He obviously knows your relative, but are you going to believe him? Like, give me your daughter. We're going to take her. You'll never see her again. She's going 450 miles away. It's from the Lord. Trust me. A little sketchy. But Laban and Bethuel actually spend some time praying, and, they say, if this is God's will, we'll let it be. I always like to ask those questions, what if? What if Rebekah's dad had refused and said, get out of here. I don't know who you are. Get away. You're not taking my daughter. Leave. If that had happened, God, the Bible would be totally different. But God knew, and so God let this happen. But if Rebekah had said no, or Bethuel, her father had said, no, you can't take Rebekah, the servant who took the oath on Abraham's thigh would have been off the hook. At that point, he's off the hook. So he's breathing a sigh of relief whether he gets a servant or the servant gets a wife back up or not, because he's done his part. He's come, he's asked, and now it's in the hands of the family. When Abraham's servant, 52, when Abraham's servant heard what they said, he bowed down to the ground before the Lord. Then the servant brought out gold and silver jewelry and articles of clothing and gave them to Rebekah. He also gave costly gifts to her brother and to her mother. And then he and the men who were there ate and drank and spent the night there. When they got up the next morning, he said, Send me on my way to my master. But her brother and her mother replied, Let the young woman remain with us 10 days or so. Then you may go. The next morning, the servant and Rebekah and the whole entourage get up. They're ready to go back the months-long journey back to Canaan. And again, if you're a mother or a parent, you can understand why they didn't really want their daughter to leave, right? They would never see her again, likely. And again, this is kind of a stranger. They believe that this is from the Lord, but they don't know this man. And this guy is taking Rebekah the very next day. The mother had good intentions. Laban probably just trying to get more silver and gold, right? He doesn't really care about his sister all that much, right? He's just in it for the money. Verse 56, but he said to them, do not detain me now that the Lord has granted success to my journey. Send me on my way so I may go to my master. Then they said, let's call the young woman and ask her about it. So they called Rebekah and asked her, will you go with this man? And I will go, she said. Again, it's been the family's asking for 10 days with her. A lot can change in a person's mind in 10 days, right? I mean, she's already got the gold and all the good things, and if she's willing to go, the servant's like, nah, we're not going to wait. I know how this turns out. You stay here, and your mom talks to you and cries, and you're so sad, and then you end up not going. He's like, let me go, and let me take her, and let's get out of here while we can. And then he asked her, will you go with me? And I will go, she said. So they sent their sister Rebekah on her way, along with her nurse and Abraham's servant and his men. And they blessed Rebekah and said to her, our sister, may you increase to thousands upon thousands. May your offspring possess the cities of their enemies. Then Rebekah and her attendants got ready and mounted the camels and went back with the man. So the servants took Rebekah and left. They left it in Rebekah's hands. So again, Rebekah now has to believe. It's now out of her family's hands. She wasn't going to be forced to go. So she also had to believe by faith that what had been told to her was going to happen. Now Isaac had come from Beer-lahai-roi, for he was living in the Negev. The Negev is the southern part of Canaan, southern part of Israel to this day. And he went out of the field one evening to meditate as he looked up and he saw camels approaching. So we stop here real quick. That's a beautiful picture. When I was growing up in Wilmore, again, small city, it was common to see people sitting outside on their front porch, rocking in the rocking chair, thinking about life, thinking about things. Nowadays with technology, many of us, definitely people my age and younger, but even older people, we don't meditate. We don't think that much anymore, right? Meditation's kind of gotten hijacked also because the word during the 60s and 70s with all the Eastern religions, people started thinking about like transcendental meditation and getting high and, all that kind of stuff. So many Christians, when you say the word meditation, they immediately get turned off. But the reality is we read time and time again, Old and New Testament, of people meditating. And what are they doing? They're meditating on God's word and on creation. David writes in the Psalms many times, when I consider the heavens and the work of your hands, and that word consider is kind of like meditate. Like when I meditate on the heavens and the work of your hands. He's meditating. So to meditate, again, just means to think deeply about a subject. And so it's neat to see that Isaac is sitting out in the field meditating upon God and the promises that he's heard from his father now for 37 years, and is just intrigued by what God has done. Verse 64, Rebekah also looked up and saw Isaac, and she got down from her camel and asked the servant, who is that man in the field coming to meet us? He is my master, the servant answered. So she took her veil and covered herself. Then the servant told Isaac all he had done, and Isaac brought her to the tent of his mother Sarah, who is deceased, and he married Rebekah. So she became his wife, and he loved her, and Isaac was comforted after his mother's death. So they're traveling, they get close to the city, they see Isaac. She says, who is that? Isaac had been working in a field. He was probably, a strong, muscle-bound, tan-looking, nice guy. And so what she does, she takes her veil and she covers herself. Again, a traditional thing to do in Middle Eastern cultures. And what we'll read later is that Rebekah was 40 years old. Isaac was 40 when they got married. And Rebekah was a little bit younger. But Abraham was about 140 years old at this time. Notice they get married. There's no mention of an elaborate wedding ceremony. Nothing's told about how they got married. It just says they went into the tent and they got married. some people ask, what does it mean to be married, and how can I get married? And people say a lot of things like, I have to be married in a church for God to see, for God to be happy with her. I've got to have a pastor officiate it. None of that's in the Bible. There's not one word of it in the Bible about pastors marrying people. There's not one word in the Bible about being married in a church or a tabernacle. We know that God created marriage. Again, if we go back to Genesis 2 and how God created man and woman and his perfect union for those two. Some people hold off getting married. I've talked to people that I can't get married because I can't afford it, or I can't get married because I can't buy the marriage license, or whatever. We hear it all the time. And I think people have heard that message time and time again. And, when we marry people, we say, by the power invested in me by the state of Kentucky or whatever. And so we hear that and we think, well, you've got to be legal. You've got to be married. You've got to have that license. But that license is only for legal reasons. God doesn't care what that paper says. And I hate to tell you, but God doesn't care what that paper says when you annul that marriage. To God, a commitment, a promise is a promise. And there are reasons that marriages don't last. And that is, God has exceptions for that. But for the most part, God is the one that ordains marriage. And again, God doesn't care about our pieces of paper. God doesn't care that you get married in a church. One of the most interesting weddings I've been a part of was right out of high school. And my friend in high school wanted to get married to this girl he dated in high school. And neither one of them cared about a big fancy ceremony. So we went down to the courthouse. And my friend's sitting here and his wife-to-be sitting here. And I'm sitting here. We're waiting for the judge executive to call us in so he can do the whole ceremony and sign and whatever. And in comes the sheriff with about 5 inmates in orange walking right in front of us. I said, man, what a way to start a marriage, like right in the middle of criminals passing. And it was crazy. But again, in the sight of the Lord, it was a legal marriage. And in this case, it was a legal marriage through the state. But again, we see that Isaac marries Rebekah. Abraham was preparing for his son's future. He was looking to protect the promises that he had received from God, that his inheritance, that his descendants would inherit this land, which is an act of faith. So now Abraham can die peacefully when he does die in the next chapter, because he knows, I have this land, this is part of the promise. I have Isaac, part of the promise. And now my son has a wife, and they have all their servants, and he'll have a family here. And now God is finally showing Abraham, now 60 some years after the promise, that he's faithful. It took a lot of faith for all of these people. It took a lot of faith for Abraham to send his servant. Took a lot of faith for the servant to go. Took a lot of faith for Rebekah to come back with the servant. A lot of faith for Rebekah's family to let them go. Took a lot of faith for Isaac to marry this woman. I mean, he'd never met her, and she got off the camel. They went into the tent, and they got married that night. Right? So a lot of faith we see taking place in Genesis 24. And with that, it is 8 o'clock. We will stop, and we'll get into Genesis 25 and maybe 26 next week. But anything anyone want to share or say, or something jumped out to you?